Hello and welcome to the Pandaverse. Today we're welcoming Nola Nash, author of Crescent City Moon. Nola, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I am Nola Nash. I am the author of Crescent City Moon, book 1 in the Crescent City series. I am an English teacher. I am also a theater director. I'm originally from South Louisiana, but I live just outside of Nashville, Tennessee now. That coming from South Louisiana is what gives me my love of the city of New Orleans, and it absolutely comes through everything that I write. There's so much mystery and history down there that it's just become a passion, researching those things and being able to put that into my fiction.
So you're going to do a reading from Crescent City Moon today, right?
I am.
Right.
I am.
Let's go ahead and do it.
Okay. We're going to spend a little time in the Louisiana swamps and meet Mama Nell today. Air hung close and thick in the depths of the soggy woods. The ground seemed to undulate beneath their carefully placed steps. One misstep and they would find themselves mired in the marshes that laced through the spongy land and cypress knees. The pair inched along the pathless swamp that held mysteries centuries old and worlds away from everything Zélie knew. The thin crescent moon seemed to cast spells and shadows, glittering on the water and shrouding the unexpected. An egret languidly raised her head from nestled sleep and contemplated the trespassers. Deeming them unworthy of alarm, she tucked her shimmering white head back under her wing as the women moved slowly on. The swamp was far from silent in the dead of night. Sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Wind whispered in her ears as frogs croaked at the water's edge. A hiss of grasses as something skittered past made her blood run cold. Zélie was trembling through to her core, unsure if it was out of fear of her surroundings or the unknown in her errand. A deep guttural tone brought her feet and her breathing to a halt. Eyes widened as she searched the darkness helplessly for the monster. Her breath rushed back to her in shallow gasps as her fear mounted. The deep, unearthly growl came from not afraid of the night or the swamp, but knew the deadliness of a mother alligator. Her hand closed around a rosary as she took a slow, long breath. Zélie clutched the crucifix at her neck with a cold, shaking hand. The throaty rumble began to retreat with a rustling of grasses as the mother monster backed away to her nest. It was several moments before either of the women moved. Angeli went first, taking Zélie by the arm as they continued their slow, arduous trek across the wilds. Deep in the black heart of the swamp, a glimmer of golden light broke through the darkness. Zélie squinted, trying to separate the shadows from one another as Angeli urged her silently on. The pair inched forward, and a house began to take shape in the darkness ahead. Zélie hoped it would be a place of salvation, but it could just as easily be the mouth of hell. She was so focused on the small sliver of light and the silhouette of the house that she lost her footing and sank into the mud. As she stumbled, a man's hand caught her elbow, and another strong hand smothered the cry that escaped her lips. Zélie whirled around and locked eyes with the same ebony face that had reassured her as she stepped out of the carriage at the edge of the swamp. In the sliver of moonlight, she saw him smile at her. "Shh, careful now, you're almost there," he whispered, then went on leading the way. Where did he come from?" Zélie asked Angeli. "Putting the horse up. We can't go that way, it's dangerous." A chill raced through Zélie as the thought of anything more treacherous than the path they took. "She's waiting for us, let's go," Angeli said with her usual abruptness and stepped around the confused Zélie. With more confident steps as the ground became more solid, the nun led the way to the house in the shadows. As they grew nearer to the cabin, candles began to appear in the windows. Light streamed out of the grime-covered panes to illuminate the landscape around the building. It seemed precariously balanced on the cypress stilts that kept it above the rising and falling swamp waters. Steps that led to the covered porch were warped and cracked at the bottom, where years of being repeatedly submerged had taken its toll on them. Lichen grew in the splintered gaps. Above, Spanish moss dripped off the edges of the covered porch. In one corner, the lace of a huge spider web glinted in the moonlight. Zélie could hardly believe this was their destination. What could Angeli possibly hope to find here? As they climbed the steps, the door creaked open and warm golden light spilled out onto the porch. In the doorway, with one hip slung out to the side and a hand resting lightly on her slender waist, stood a woman unlike Zaley had ever seen. Layers of skirts and scarves and rich color seemed to hover around her, swirling as she moved to motion them inside. Her head was wrapped in a pigment of deep reds, oranges, and greens, and her skin was the color of fine caramel. Behind long black lashes, mossy green eyes glittered in the candlelight. Bracelets clinked softly on her wrists, and rings glinted on her fingers. She was both stunning and strange. "I've been waiting for you, Cherie," the woman said in a rich, silken voice as she took Zaley's hand in hers. "This night's been a long time coming." There was a softness in the accent that reassured Zaley a bit, even if the woman herself seemed ethereal and exotic. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," Zaley said softly. Anjali spoke up. "This is Mama Nell. She's your godmother, so to speak." Zaley looked at the strange vision before her and tried desperately to make sense of what was just said. "I don't understand," Mama Nell finished. "I know. Come in and I'll explain." She led them to a small circle of chairs in the corner of the house. As they walked through, Zaley realized the cabin was a single room divided by furniture and shelves. Lining the walls were small boxes, bottles, and jars. It was difficult to tell what was inside them all. There were few labels, and the ones that did exist were aged and illegible. A long workbench was on one side of the room with more jars and other odd things scattered on top. Herbs, small sacks, and nets hung from the rafters stretched across the room below the high vaulted ceiling, designed to let the heat rise well above the living space. The whole place was tidy but covered in layers of dust in varying thicknesses. An earthy mustiness mingled with the fragrances of herbs Zaley couldn't identify. Then she noticed something she didn't expect to find in a place like this. Books, shelves of them. Some were leather-bound, while others appeared to have been hand-sewn to bind them. All of them were old and well-worn. "I suppose I should start from the beginning," Mama Nell said as she draped herself on one of the armchairs. It was almost as if she was liquid. Every motion seemed to flow from the last to the next. There was a mysterious elegance about her that wasn't cold and pretentious like the socialite airs Zaley was used to. The black man from earlier brought a tray of coffee in and set it on a small table next to Mama Nell. "Thank you, Vernon." Zaley saw him give Mama Nell a wink as he stepped back into the shadows until needed again, a bit more than a servant, Zaley thought. With movements that would shame a dancer, Mama Nell poured coffee for her guests, completely at ease in her house in the middle of the terrifying swamp.
That was awesome.
I love the way you read that.
Me
Thank
too.
you.
Oh my gosh.
It
She's so
brings tears to
eloquent. Yes.
Oh,
And the accent, it's just like perfect.
Yes.
Thank you very much. That's years and years and years of theater. I always thought, it would be fun to actually do the audiobooks for my own books because
Yeah, it
like,
would
the
be.
voices are so much a part of me. It's like they're in my head.
I mean, as soon as you start speaking with the accent, I start to tear because it's so authentic,
It
People
is.
feel like
You
you're
feel like
there.
you're there. Yes.
You feel like you're there, right?
Yes.
Like Mama Nell's like, when she interrupts and she's like, "You don't understand, right?" I was like,
It
"Oh,
like
you
draws
don't
you
understand."
in.
Understand.
Yes. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wow.
It's
Yeah.
one of the major moments. So yeah, it's not quite the ending of it. There's twice that they go into the swamp, and this is the first time that she discovers Mama Nell's cabin through the help of Anjali. But something definitely interesting happens. Very big happens in the swamp this time. Well, both times.
So how much time did you spend in the swamp personally researching this?
Well, actually, I just growing up where I grew up, you spend a lot of time kind of driving through swamps. I mean, there's lots of roads, and I mean, they're raised, they're bridges basically, and you get on a bridge that goes forever. And so you're driving through the swamps and you're seeing these things. And, I've been on swamp tours and things like that, where you just get on an airboat and you're going through the swamps and all these little inlets and places and all the cypress trees and cypress knees that kind of stick up out of the water. And it's very difficult to tell.
Every once
in
in a while you see a house and you go, someone actually lives out here.
Oh yeah, and the people that live out there, and there are people that live in the Louisiana swamps, and most of what they do, they get back and forth to their houses by boat. And so, there are certain places in the swamp that are a bit more solid than others. But the way that the grasses and everything grow in the swamp, oftentimes it's very difficult to tell what's solid ground and what's not. And so if you're walking out there, you really do need to know exactly where you're going and what truly is something you can walk on, because you could very quickly just fall into the water. And that water, there's that old song, Old Black Water, and it's truly, it's black water. I mean, you can't tell what you're walking into, and you can't see the bottom of it. You can't see an inch below the surface in most cases. So you're just, it's really dark and mysterious, and at the same time, it has this gracefulness, this beauty about it, and so much of it has to do with the palmetto leaves that are swaying out in the kind of grassy areas, and the Spanish moss that's like lacing the trees, and it just sways so gently with just the slightest breeze. And so it's, in many ways, it's very frightening and scary and dangerous, but at the same time it's also delicate and beautiful. And so it has this really interesting juxtaposition between those two things in the swamp. And so during the day, it can be just mysterious and beautiful, but at night, it is not somewhere you want to be. It is
It's very
deadly.
There's animals that hunt at night out there.
One more reason to stay inside. All I'm saying.
All you're saying. Now, where's your sense of adventure, Nicole?
No, I have none. Zero.
Need to go down south and
Ugh.
get the bayous.
It's a lot of fun. I mean, I have done a few of those tours, and it's really interesting. And you can feed the alligators marshmallows on the swamp boat tours. It's so fun. They know. I mean, alligators aren't stupid. I don't care what anybody says. They're not just a mindless dinosaur hunter. They learn really quickly. They hear the motor of that boat come in with the tour guide, and they start swimming, as slow as they swim, to the boat side, because they know that you're going to be throwing marshmallows over the side of the boat, and they're going to
That's adorable.
marshmallows, like little jumbo marshmallows.
They have a sweet tooth.
Yeah,
They
who
do.
knew?
I mean, you just chuck marshmallows at them, and they catch, and they're just. It's
It's
weird.
like the it's
I
like
didn't know they
the
ate that.
It reminds
It's like
me of
the seals.
the Disney alligator.
Yeah.
Right.
The little fancy one.
yeah
Yep.
same idea but less dancing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Less dancing.
It's kind of like the seals, the harbor seals in Monterey, California. They come right up to the
I know.
to the wharf, and they'll go because they want you to buy some fish and feed them.
And feed them. It's so funny.
Marshmallows are cheaper than fish. So
True.
just
Yeah.
whole
that's
bag
true.
for like $1.50. Just
But I
feed
don't know
all
if the- I don't know if the
all
seals-
alligators.
I don't know if the seals would like marshmallows.
Hey, you never know.
You never know.
No, you never know. One of the last swamp tours that I did was in Barataria Swamp. And Barataria actually comes into play, it will come into play in book 3 of the Crescent City series, specifically Barataria. So that one's kind of cool. There's an old cemetery, like as you're coming out and into one bend of it, there's the cemetery of all this. Yeah, in the swamp. Like, there are some places that are solid ground. And so there's actually a cemetery, and it's right up against the water, and then you can go into some of the canals and things are a bit deeper into the swamp. But Barataria is where the pirate brothers Pierre and Jean Lafitte hid out. And so in book 3, the Lafitte brothers come into play, and so
That
we
sounds
spend
so
a little
cool.
time in Barataria, which is kind of fun.
Pirates. I love pirates.
Pirates. I adore pirates. I'm a huge,
Oh, I
huge
can't wait.
pirate person. Like,
That's fun.
my fandom of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies is sort of becoming a joke in my family. They're like, Mom, stop. But I love those movies. I will do anything for Gina and Pierre Lafitte were interesting as far as pirates go, because sometimes they were, going against the law, and other times they were recruited by the law because they knew ins and outs, they knew ways to get to things, and depending on what was going on, especially around the War of 1812, they were actually employed by the government. So they were very much, not so much pirates exclusively as they were privateers. And so they could be bought by the highest bidder, whether that bidder was people trying to cheaply and somewhat illegally import goods from France, or if they were, the government trying to get some people hidden out and kind of do an ambush during the War of 1812. So it depended on who was actually paying them the most. That's really all that mattered to the Lafittes.
Some of that still goes on too. It hasn't.
Oh yeah, that's still pirating.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But they were pretty cool, and the people of New Orleans loved them because they were bringing all of this great stuff in, and so nobody in the city was going to turn in the Lafitte's. Like, why would we do that? They bring us stuff. We like them. So anybody who wanted anything to do with the Lafitte brothers to actually, catch them had to do it on their own. The people of New Orleans were not going to help.
And if you want somebody to disappear permanently,
there's lots of places and ways for that.
out in the swamps.
Yep, they actually used to, for a while, during the yellow fever epidemics, they would bury people out in the swamps because they were trying to get the bodies as far away from the city as they could. And during the epidemics, they were quite literally piling up in the streets. They couldn't put them in the morgues. There was nothing that could be done. And so they'd start hauling them by truckloads out into the swamps and try to sink the bodies out there just to get them away, because they weren't sure at the time they weren't sure how the yellow fever was actually being transmitted. And so they just needed the bodies as far away as they could get them.
So it's even more haunted, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Nola, your books are not just creepy because like you write creepiness. It's because there's truth behind them.
Exactly.
There's truth about the cemetery and the spirits in there. There's got to be some truth to because the bodies are in the walls, the gates as you're going through. Yeah. I find this out, I'm like, then now you're telling me about the cemetery and the swamps. I'm just like,
Oh, no.
My God.
Yes.
Now, do they actually try to bury the people below ground in these swamp areas? Is that?
They were sinking the bodies as much as they could sink them. They were just in the water. I mean, as much as they could get them. They were not trying to dig a hole. They knew that they couldn't do that. I mean, you couldn't dig a hole in solid ground to bury a body in New Orleans. It would pop back up the next time it flooded because of the water table being so high. They would sink the bodies out there. There are certain places where there are actually cemeteries that was high enough, but they are not very deep graves, I would imagine, because you're in the swamp and that water table is going to rise and fall. In Bayou Manchac, which is upriver from New Orleans, up around the German coast, or the river plantations on the German coast, Bayou Manchac has got a cemetery in it, but it is actually more, some of the burial grounds in Bayou Manchac have more to do with what they call the Maroons, the slaves that would run away from plantations, and they would actually go and form communities that lived in the depths, in the deep hearts of the swamp, so that they were less likely to be caught there. And so they had what they called the Maroon communities in the swamps, and there are cemeteries there. There's one in Bayou Manchac.
Wow.
That leads me to a question, Miss Nola.
Yes. Sure.
I've been to New Orleans once, and I loved it except for the heat, but the history of everything, and that there's just so much history with all the different cultures. How do you decide what you want to put in the book versus what you keep out of the book of all the history? And I mean, I know time obviously is a factor, but with some of the quote unquote ghost stories and stuff like that.
A lot of what I kind of pick people, and I guess the Easter eggs in my book are really more about the real people and places and some historical events that actually happened in New Orleans in that time. And so Father Antoine, Père Antoine, is the priest in the very beginning of this book. And this book, the timeline of the book was selected because it coincides with his death. He dies almost immediately in the book, so I'm not giving anything away here. So his death was in 1829. And so the book is 1829 because I needed him as the real person. He was a well-loved priest. In fact, he is said to walk the alleyway between St. Louis Cathedral and the Cabildo. And people will see him in his robes, and he was a very beloved man. He was also very good friends with Marie Laveau. They work together in a lot of charitable projects. And so I wanted to use Father Antoine in the book. And so because of that, it sort of set the stage for what I can use historically, which also kind of lends itself to where I'm going with the ghost story part of it. Is so what would have been accepted at that time? What would have been something that, what it was daily life at that time? And so what can I actually incorporate into that would make sense? And so each of these books and using Father Antoine actually set me up for being able to subsequently use the Lafitte brothers later.
Oh, awesome.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I used to work with a guy that he was kind of like an amateur ghost hunter, and he used to go on trips up to St. Augustine. This is when I lived in Florida. He'd go up to St. Augustine and at night, and they would take digital photography pictures of different areas that were known to be haunted, in the community, and they would actually get the pictures of the little floating balls and everything in their pictures. So, I mean, he was, and sometimes you could actually make out a torso that there's just one street that they've backfilled since the 1800s, but they backfilled it, so the street level's actually about 3 feet higher than it was then, and you actually can see in some of the pictures that he showed me, people are like half torso
Like
right
cut
above
off,
the
yeah.
top.
No.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's like Fort Eustis in Virginia.
Huh.
That has a lot of ghost story. They actually closed homes because of ghosts living there from the Civil War era. I had a friend that I had to help move out of her home because of it.
Oh,
Well,
Yeah.
Well, in New Orleans, though, very different. Because in New Orleans, they don't close the homes. They actually charge more for them.
Right.
Well, I
It's
think
on
it's
the
like
tour.
military stuff, like things with-
Everybody wants that.
Yeah, everybody. Oh, it's just crazy.
Now, in fact, they will advertise real estate as haunted. Like it's on the real estate sign. If it's known to have ghost stories and hauntings associated with it, it'll have like the realtor's name and number and all
Yeah,
this
yeah.
stuff for more information called haunted.
It's because
And, I
it's
mean-
military. It's because it was military.
Yeah.
If it's a benevolent spirit, I wouldn't mind. I mean, my mom lives next to a cemetery, and we think there's a benevolent spirit that just comes in. She sometimes rattles some pots and pans, turns on a light or two. We're like, that's fine, no worries.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's the kind of thing that people love, and they want more of that. However, there are some places that they are not as benevolent.
No.
There was an apartment that people struggled keeping a tenant in because it was just a one-bedroom apartment, and a man would come and sit on the foot of the bed and just sit there. It wasn't actually doing anything, but would sit on the foot of the bed. And it would freak people out to have this ghost man just sitting on the foot of the bed. And so people would just
I can't
break the
imagine
lease
why.
and move out. I can't imagine why.
Totes
You
normal.
didn't do anything. But there are several places in New Orleans that have, pretty intense paranormal activity. In fact, a friend of mine, she's,
Why?
I mean,
The
well,
stories
there's-
that you have about like the burying of people, like on top of each other, trying to bury them in the swamp. Of course, they're angry.
oh yeah, there's a lot of angry ones.
Spirits. They're like furious. I feel that for them.
And there's a lot of different, there's so much time. And New Orleans being such an old city for the United States, I mean, it had its 300th birthday a few years ago. And so it's been around for a long time, and it's been inhabited by so many different cultures throughout that time. I mean, you had, the Native American population that was there, and then you have the French and the Spanish, and then you bring in the African slaves, the Caribbean slaves coming up from the Haitian revolt. So many people moved into the city from after that. So you've got a lot of culture and a lot of unrest in that city because it was, it just had such a flux the whole time. And so you have that unrest in life, which also gives you that unrest in death. And I think that's why the people of New Orleans have always sort of embraced that about this city. Is you always, there's always that kind of that feeling when you're walking down the street, it doesn't matter if you're walking down the street alone, you know you're not alone. And there's as many, dead as living walking the quarter at any given time. And you just accept that.
And then you have periodic hurricanes that blow through, and
and that changes the energy so much in the city too. I mean, there's just a lot going on in that city, and the fact that that type of energy and paranormal things and just the spirituality of that city embraces those things and is okay with those things, I think kind of perpetuates that feeling of it too. It's one of those things, when you're open to it, you're going to experience more of it.
Yeah,
And that's just the city itself.
Where else do they have instead of a funeral procession, you have a parade?
I know.
Exactly. A jazz funeral is like, that's awesome. They're interesting. They celebrate death as much as they celebrate life there. And it truly is, it's that crossing over. It's a celebration of the person's life, but it's also, celebrating that they've moved on to something better, and they get that. I mean, they're for a city that has so much that has to do with death and haunting. And in fact, there is a museum of death. Like, that's a museum, the Museum of Death, in New Orleans, just outside of the quarter. But they celebrate life so much that I think in so many ways, it's as if they're hesitant to give up that type of life. When they die, they're clinging so much to this celebration of life that they had and this love of life that they had, that it's difficult for people's spirits, even, not the ones that were just, torn violently from their lives. And so now they're haunting and, ooh, kind of spirits, but even people who are just, so in love with the life that they had there, they just don't want to leave. So it's an interesting dynamic in that city, and it makes a lot of modern fiction set in that really dynamic and really interesting, but it also does a lot for the history, because that has been a common thread throughout the 300 years of that city is that same kind of spirituality and that understanding, the passion for life. And if you think about how that city started, they were just, you had to really want to survive there.
Right.
I mean, between the heat and the pestilence, and they were sent there with nothing to start this colony and, to be in this city, they had to want it bad, and they did. And so there was a lot of just really putting their heart and soul into that city, just simply to survive and then to thrive. And it's some of the buildings that are in the French Quarter are almost 300 years old. Just the construction of them, those buildings are still there. And so they carry with them, it's kind of like, if those walls could talk, they've got 300 years of history that they can share, and tumultuous history of that.
I mean, I barely made it 5 days in New Orleans, so I can't imagine a 300-year-old house. I mean, the heat alone was enough to kill me. But the history, like you said, is just so, it's a joyful society. They're just, I mean, not even for a funeral, they just, let's throw a parade and just walk down the street with a jazz band. And it's like, that's amazing how they could do that. And I love that.
Yeah, you really don't know if what's coming down the street is a funeral or a wedding,
right?
Until you see what's coming down behind the band, because it's always the band first. Yep. And then you either see the bride and groom or you see the casket. Like, one of the two is going to follow the band. And then it's all the party people with their umbrellas going and their white handkerchiefs, the second line. And that's why my Facebook group is Nola's Second Line, because it's always, the second line actually comes from the group of people that will join one of those parades, because the parade itself is started by the families and friends. So it's like the wedding party or the funeral party. That's the first line. The second line is the group of people that are complete and total strangers that just join the party. They just follow them down the street.
I'm totally a second liner.
Absolutely. So it's like, hey, it's a parade. I'm going. And they just go. And so they're going to celebrate whatever these people in front of them have hired a band to celebrate, whether it's a funeral or it's a wedding. I mean, we're going with it. And so any excuse for a parade in New Orleans, but that's why my Facebook group is the second line.
Yeah, I think we all need to plan a trip together, and we all need to go and be in the second line.
We should.
Totally should.
We should do it for Nola's book. Put Nola's book on a sign. Let her be the first line, and we'll be her second line in the back.
That would be so much fun.
We'll do a virtual Zoom one.
I think it's really important.
Guerrilla marketing at its best.
The transfer of life to death. And I think it's cool that like a whole community does it. Because I did that when I lost my stepmom. with my circle of friends.
Right.
We had a celebration, and a lot of my friends like didn't come because they were like, "What are you doing?" But like the transition, you know. So I think it's cool that they do that. But where did you come up? So where, with all of these spirits going on, right? Where did you come up with Solene?
That is actually based slightly on the Bell Witch in Tennessee.
I'm sorry?
The Bell Witch of Adams, Tennessee is sort of where I got the idea from her, just for the voice itself, that kind of disembodied voice. Kate is the Bell Witch of Adams, Tennessee, and she haunted the Bell family. And it is a fascinating story about the evolution of this spirit from just, you know, scratching sounds on the outside of their walls to full-on conversations with groups of people, including some very prominent leaders. Andrew Jackson went there, and he had an encounter with the Bell Witch of Tennessee, and he talked about how intelligent Kate was. But at the same time, she did horrible things to people. She had a couple of people she didn't like. She did not like the father, and she did not like his daughter. And there are other family members that she left completely alone, but she kind of picked and chose based on certain things she didn't like, and she would target them. And one of the things that made her such a force to be reckoned with is that they couldn't see her. They could feel her, they could hear her. She would taunt them, but she would also do horrible things to them physically, but they couldn't see her. And I use her story when I teach suspense to my students, because we talk about those elements of, you know, human fear. What do people fear? We play on human instincts when we're trying to design something that's suspenseful or frightening. And humans depend on being able to see where the danger is coming from in order to either brace for it or run away from it, that whole fight or flight thing. And if you can't see where the danger is, you can't prepare for it, because you don't know what the danger is, you don't know where it's coming from, so you don't know what your reaction should be. And so taking that lesson that I've taught them using the Bell Witch, I created Selene as this force that you cannot see coming. And so she can do all of these things to you, but you can't brace for it. And she has these moments where she's almost pleasant and just slightly irritating being in her mind. And then there are those moments of just cold-blooded killer. And you don't know what's going to set her off. You don't know what mood she's in, and the mood she's in determines the danger level. And so since you can't see her to even get a gauge of, you know, you don't have an expression on her face to know, oh my God, she's in a horrible mood today.
Yeah.
You just have to brace for everything. Yep, and then, so she became kind of that embodiment of fight or flight, and that thing that we cannot control because we cannot see it.
Wow.
I think that makes a great
scary.
protagonist, because you want to be like, oh, she's really okay, and then all of a sudden, bam, you're like, oh, she is not okay. And I think that makes it, that depth of character, so much more interesting.
And she does things from, you know, just sing-songing nonsense in Zaley's head to, you know, trying to drown someone or, you know, murdering someone in their bed. And then she starts singing bawdy bar songs. I mean, at one point she's singing like just nasty sailor songs. They're horrible. But she's just singing away. And so it's like, oh my God, this woman is nuts. And she is. And it's that unpredictability of madness too, that I kind of combine those two things. And those are lessons that I teach my students. And I kind of mashed all of those lessons. And it's one of the reasons why my students enjoy this book too, is because once they've had that lesson from me and they read this, they see what I'm talking about in Selene, because she's that madness that kind of rides that roller coaster. And there's those moments of sanity, those moments of clarity, and then she goes spiraling off in another direction. So she's unpredictable in so many ways. So combining that level of fear of the unknown, fear of the unseen, with the unpredictability of madness and what that can actually do to the people around that person. She's perfectly content with whatever it is that she's doing. She has no problem with what she's doing. But everyone around her then has to deal with it.
and you have the police officers trying to fit everything into a logical flow and solve the murder.
Right.
And then you have Zooli, who's tormented. She's caught in between, the world that she wants to be and the world that her mother wants for her.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and she's trying to find the logic in it too, and it takes a while for her to even let go of it, and it's really, she lets go of it a lot sooner than Louis does, and that's one of the reasons that Louis is in the story anyway. I mean, it's always fun to have that romantic interest. We all fall in love with Louis. We love Louis. He's just the best. But Louis is really there because he reflects the reader's logic, that this cannot happen. Everything about, all of the New Orleans paranormal stories, one of the things that makes them so great is that they are just the other side of believable. And it's walking that fine line between, yes. And so Louis is the one trying to stay really hard on the logical side of the line, and Zaley's got her toe over into the paranormal side of the line, and they have to eventually both step much further over that line than they're comfortable with. But Louis is sort of the reader's voice of logic, going, it could almost happen. That's real. That I can see, but this other thing here doesn't make any sense. That logically can't happen. And then the more that the logic, the surreal and the real kind of start to blend together, then the more you start to kind of get with Louis on the whole thing, where he has to really kind of just take that logic and throw it all the way out the window, because he's not going to solve this case using what he's used to. And the readers have to throw it out the window too, because you're not gonna follow this to the end. You're not gonna be able to predict the ending of this mystery if you continue to follow that logical path. It's just not gonna happen.
The story gradually erodes the reader's disbelief,
Right.
until they finally suspend it and they say, yeah, okay, this could happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's so many characters in there that understand that fine line, and that's why Mama Nell is in there as well. And one of the reasons Mama Nell is in there, Mama Nell is a voodoo priest. I adore Mama Nell. She's got spunk. She's just so wise, and yet at the same time, she is just of the earth, and I absolutely love her. She's just all of the elements together. She's got this fiery spirit, but she moves like water. She's grounded in the earth, and everything just kind of flows over her like air does. I mean, she's all four of the magical elements in one person. And she's such an interesting character, but being the voodoo priestess that she is her role is protector. She's teaching Zaley how to protect herself, and she is protecting Zaley from this other force. And so many people view voodoo as something dark and evil and frightening, when voodoo came up as a protective thing. This is people taking elements from the earth and their surroundings and nature and combining that with their knowledge of kind of ancient spirits for a form of protection. Does that mean that protection often means doing something bad to somebody else kind of as a defense? Yes, it does. And did people kind of take that and do some dark things with it? Of course they did. But the roots of voodoo practice are a spiritual practice of protection. And so rather than Hollywoodize the whole voodoo practice, I took it and made that character what it was intended to be. She's a protector of Zaley, and she's teaching her how to protect herself. So the twist here is that the voodoo priestess is actually the good guy. And that's not how most of the voodoo is ever really portrayed in Hollywood and television, often in books. It's not true to it. And because the city and the people are so important to me, I wanted that to be true to their beliefs as well. And so I've spent a lot of time getting to know that practice and making sure that I am doing justice by it and the people that it is valuable to. It's like any other faith or religion, even though it can be practiced alongside others, it does not have to necessarily be a religion by itself. It can be, but a lot of people practice it in conjunction with their own faith. But it is something that they take very seriously there. And I wanted to be true to that and to them. And not only that, but when you do that, and you do what is truly done in New Orleans, it becomes, because it is done that way, then that helps you to walk that line between the supernatural and the natural, the spiritual world. And so it's, again, using what is really done to create that realism that makes everything else that's the paranormal side believable, because the other stuff is really what they do.
Didn't you tell me that the voodoo priestess was friends or worked with the Catholic priest?
Marie Laveau did, yes. She was friends with, she was friends with Father Antoine, and they both worked with yellow fever patients and other charity work that they did together. Marie Laveau, not only was she the voodoo queen of New Orleans, she was a hairdresser, and she was a devout Catholic, which most people don't know. So as a devout Catholic, she knew Father Antoine quite well, and they worked with the poor, they worked with the sick, they were very good friends and respected each other for what they did for the community, even though, he might not necessarily have approved of the, the voodoo work that she did, but as long as she was doing good for those in the city that he was also there to serve spiritually and protect, he was, you do your thing, I'll do mine, and we'll do what we can together, which was a really interesting relationship. And they really and truly are the embodiment of what the Catholic Church and the voodoo spirituality were in New Orleans. They might have been separate and kind of condemned as separate things in other parts of the world, but in the city of New Orleans, they very much worked together.
And that's how your book was.
Yeah.
With them,
exactly.
working together, yeah.
Yes, because we have the nuns, we have the Catholic nuns who are helping as well. And so, that's one of the reasons why I did that, is when you bring those two things together, that's actually authentically how some of those things were done. Maybe they weren't done publicly as much that way. Not always, but Father Antoine was one of those who publicly was good friends with Marie Laveau, so that was okay. Bringing those two things together is not unusual. It may seem like it, but again, for the people who understand the city and its history rather well, they'll get that okay, yeah, those people might have actually worked together on something like this.
There's a passage in the Bible I remember reading that commented on that basically said that we have it backwards. We should mourn people being born into the world and celebrate their leaving the world.
It does, and it goes back to, everyone is of the earth, and everything in voodoo culture, it's called Ashe, and the Ashe is the spirit that is in everything in the earth, every leaf, every rock, every person, every animal. And it's using that energy, that Ashe, to kind of serve the person, but in the best way. So, if you're protecting, if you're, and whatever you put out there into the world energy wise, it's going to kind of return to you. And so, there are certain people who have trained themselves to become a bit more in tune with that than others. And that's where you get the voodoo priestesses and, those people who have made it more of a concentrated study. And are more able to help kind of the common people. But the great thing about voodoo and hoodoo and every kind of amalgamation of that is that it's accessible to anyone who wants to reconnect with the world around them, the earth around them, the energy and the spirits around them, which is great because, you can have, all these massive voodoo ceremonies, but you can also be kind of that lone practitioner on your own, kind of muddling your way through the things that mean something to you. And that's kind of what Mama Nell is trying to show Zaylee in this book is, here's the things that you need to know for what you are experiencing. She's not going to try to, go into a whole religious thing with her and, all of the deities that there are and the Orisha. She's not getting into all of that. She just simply is saying, here's what you need to know. This is what you need to know about herbs. This is what you need to know about candle magic. This is what you need to know about protection. And it's giving her the tools that she needs. And that's kind of where the hoodoo and the voodoo is accessible to everyone, because you can find those things that are just specifically what you need without feeling like you have to know everything there is to know about that faith to be a part of it.
Which is amazing.
Like when I
I was just gonna say that's amazing.
Well, yeah, because when I read the book, and we had the conversation, I thought about shamanism.
Mhm.
It's very close to shamanism, which I
It is.
practice. It's very close.
It's
You know,
very close.
So close. It's like, and it's just like religion. They're all very close.
Right.
So,
Well, the truth,
and you
Hey,
made it
the truth
very,
is the
like you
truth.
said, you made it
And,
very accessible to everybody.
I'm gonna have to
Okay.
leave. We pushed supper back so I
Okay.
can do this. So
all right. Thanks, Chris.
bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Nola, you are wonderful. I love you.
Much love, say. Love you.
Enjoy your vacation.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that people don't understand about the voodoo faith, and hopefully through the course of these books, they're going to understand a bit more about it, because, Zaylee doesn't know anything about it either. And so that's kind of one way that I've allowed the readers to learn about it as well, is they're learning about it through her needing to learn about it. And it develops. And I mean, this is things I'm reading for researching the other books. I've got my 365 Days of Hoodoo. I've got Throwing the Bones. I've got to learn how to do bone reading. And I have my Voodoo Doll spell book. So all things that, anything that I've written about, any of the practices that are in here, I've done.
You actually let some people in New Orleans read your book and comment on it.
Yes.
And on its authenticity and everything. So I thought that was really good too.
And
Absolutely.
and it just shows the respect you have for the practice, for the people who practice it, and I think that's important in a type of book where you do lean into some of these what would be considered quote unquote out there. People hear voodoo, they think the dolls, and they think you're stabbing somebody. So I think, and especially it being a young adult book, I think that's even more important, because you're hitting them when they're young, and then they're going, oh, I get it. It's nothing weird, Well, I was just gonna say, with your book, with the whole, like I said, the voodoo, the hoodoo, all kind of the mystical stuff, I think in this day and age, it's so much more acceptable for that stuff that even me, who's writing a contemporary cozy mystery, puts tarot reading in it in the second one. So like it's kind of acceptable. I know, spoiler, it's acceptable in the wide world of everywhere. And I think I like I said, I think it's a special time to do that, because people are more open-minded to, and that was one of the best things about the because I did a hop on hop off tour in New Orleans, because it was 1,000 degrees and I'm like, I ain't walking everywhere, and
Big double-decker bus.
yeah, and I wanted to get the most history, because I don't know if I'm ever going to go back, because it was so hot. But you learn, that's where I learned about Madame Laveau and the father, and I bought 2 books about her life, and it's just when you immerse yourself in it, you're like, it just makes it all the more real. And I think that's one of the strengths of your book, is that it really does feel like a fully realized, oh my God, I'm back in New Orleans in the 1800s. What happened? Like, what's going on?
I think the nightlife in New Orleans evolved to a different level, just because people tend to go out more at night, because the sun's down, it's a little cooler. Usually the breeze is blowing more at night.
Full disclosure, I was there for a mystery writer conference, so I went to bed early because it was a long. But I did go get beignets at like 4 a.m, because I'm like, oh, it'll be totally cooler at 4 a.m.
4 a.m.
No.
Parties are just getting started.
Yeah, no, people are like drinking, and I'm like, hey, wide awake, like ready for some beignets. And I was the only one at Cafe Du Monde, and for some reason but again, that's the type of city where I didn't feel, like you said, alone at 4 a.m. drinking a coffee at Cafe Du Monde. I felt like the town was still around, and people were around, and all. And then I walked back to the hotel at like 5, and it was like, you don't feel alone, and that's a lovely feeling. Because we have some of that feeling up in New England too, where it's an old city, it's an old place. You go to Plymouth Rock, walk around. You go, Cape Cod with all the ghost stories. There's a little bit of comfort in that, and that's what your book is. Comforting feeling, because you're like, I know these people, and I want to go on their journey.
Yeah, and to me, this city is alive. I mean, it's a weird, and it kind of comes down to that. I personify the city a lot in my writing, and just because to me, the city of New Orleans, it is a character as much as any of the other characters in the book. The city itself is a character. It's more than a setting. I think there are settings that are great settings, and then I think there are settings that live their own life with the characters. And I do personify New Orleans quite a bit in the book because to me, you know, she's alive and she's right there with you, welcoming you in. You start to grow roots, whether you know, like it or not. It's one of those cities that will always, you know, once you've been there, it stays with you.
Oh, for sure.
It's an amazing, different, vibrant place that, you know, does it have its downside and its dark sides and its problems? Absolutely. Every major city does. It's not immune to any of that. And, you know, just all my love of New Orleans, you know, I don't want anybody to think that I see it through rose-colored glasses. I don't. I totally acknowledge the flaws that city has, but I think that you can choose what you want to focus on. With any city, with any place that you are. And for me, the city holds magic, and it always will. And the history and the magic are woven together so tightly in that city that it's very difficult to separate one from the other. If you try to, you unravel the whole thing. And that's why I like to write about the city the way that I do, is because one cannot inherently live without the other.
Mhm.
And to me, it's just that beautiful marriage of those two things that makes that city so special.
And you can tell that that's how you write it. And it like I said, it's a beautiful thing.
It's a lot of fun. I mean, and the authenticity of things is very important to me. I want people to be able to experience these things in a way that is real, as opposed to the Hollywood stylized, you know, things. Like there's a seance, and there's the candle magic, there's the different, you know, ceremonies, and the making the herbs into oils and all of these things. And for me, there's such a sensory experience that if you don't do those things, it's very difficult to write a sensory experience you've not experienced yourself. And so, I mean, I've got a whole section of my living room that is kind of my little magical corner over there. And I've got herbs and stones and tarot cards, you know, various sets of tarot cards. And I had to learn to read tarot cards and, you know, all of these things that I've done. I have a working voodoo altar in my bedroom because for me, it's keeping that tradition and doing those things in a way that, you know, I can write about everything from the curl of the wax as you're carving a candle, and the feeling that kind of the blade in the wax and what that feels like, that kind of dragging through, to just the silkiness of the oil on your fingers as you're dressing the candle and you're rolling it in the herbs, and just, you know, the way that those oils and herbs work together and the way that they smell as you're burning that, and, you know, all of the different things that is that full-on sensory experience that you're not going to get just by looking at things on the internet. I mean, you can get a gist of it, but it's very hard to give someone else that experience unless you can describe everything, not just the sights, but the sounds, the smell, the touch, just the feel of it all. And experiencing those things myself has become kind of a quest for me. I mean, I'm collecting, I have the learning how to read bones for the third book, so, and the voodoo doll, so I'm collecting the materials that I need to actually learn how to do this and to do this. You know, I will be making the voodoo dolls that do these things. I will be making a bone throwing set and learning how to read that. I'm constantly turning to a friend of mine who's a medium and, you know, tarot card reader, and she does wonderful things in New Orleans. She's a paranormal investigator in New Orleans. And I have a friend who's a voodoo priestess down there, and I'm constantly turning to them and making sure that whatever I'm writing about is authentic. And, you know, they're the ones that I had read this because I wanted them to give me the okay and say, yes, you did justice by what is precious to us. And the reason that I'm able to do that is because they have helped me experience those things. I mean, Willow and I did a seance together, and so I was kind of walking through that whole process with her to know how that was going to work, and what it felt like, what her role was, what my role was, and, you know, how she kind of walked me through what was happening and giving me, instructions on what I needed to do. Just that whole experience. I mean, those things you can't get from the internet. And hopefully you get it from my book if you're not able to actually do them yourselves. But I think some of it is taking the fear out of those things and taking the taboo out of those things. And so maybe now other people will be curious and want to learn a little bit more about tarot cards, candle magic, seances, all of those things that don't have the negativity attached to them. In my book that they do in kind of the Hollywood stylized things that maybe they're just more accessible now. And so you can actually try it without that fear of being sucked into a Ouija board. Yeah, and don't get me wrong. I love the city of New Orleans and I love all of these things, and it's taking a lot of the negativity out of it. But in truth, it's a creepy book. It was designed to give you the creeps, but it does that because it is so authentic, and that's one of those things that again, playing on human fear, that and triggering that in the reader is that it is believable, because so much of it is authentic and can be done, that you start to blur that line between what can be done and what is impossible. It starts to get harder and harder to determine the difference between the two. And as that becomes more difficult, the fear factor starts to rise a little bit more. And the second book is even more intense. It gets darker. It gets wilder in the second book, Crescent City Sin. It gets a little nuts, and they're in a couple of places. It gets really dark. We start to really explore the underbelly of New Orleans and Gallatin Street, which is not there anymore, but it was a really low life red light district. There were bars, there were brothels. Basically the buildings were kind of slapped together out of whatever it was that they could find. They looked like if you breathed on them too hard, they'd fall down. But it was sort of where all the sailors would go when they first got off the boats. And so it was a rough area. And so there's some time spent in that area. So we really get gritty in the second book, as much as this one lays some of the groundwork for some of the magic that's here, and the difference between the voodoo practice and the kind of earthiness of Mama Nell, and then the socialite French Quarter life that Zélie has. We start to add into the mix. We continue with those things, but we add into the mix that real gritty underbelly of Gallatin Street and what element that can bring into the story as well.
That is a big market tease, and I cannot wait. That was good.
And she has
It's
and
good.
she has a book
I
called
love it.
Traveler coming out that's completely different take on
Totally.
it.
Very different. Completely different. It kind of blurs the line between time travel and women's fiction.
Even better.
Yeah,
My
that
two
one,
favorite things.
it's modern day, except she's sucked into memories of past lives, and so there's the history there. There's absolutely no New Orleans in that series,
Okay.
believe it or not.
Well,
There's
'cause
Rome.
it's all in your other book.
It is. And then the Sylvie series, Sylvie's Pen, is coming out also kind of on the heels of Traveler, hopefully. Sylvie's Pen is not paranormal. So Sylvie's Pen actually kind of, it's 1850s New Orleans, and it is lighter, it's funny, it's set, it is the French Quarter elite, but it's sort of the lighter side of life and kind of the sense of humor that New Orleans has about itself and each other, and kind of the blurring of the social lines and social ladder that is there in the French Quarter. So all three series are very, very different. The Crescent City series is definitely, it's the dark, mysterious side of New Orleans. The Sylvie series is lighter and more fun, but still very much that character of New Orleans and the city itself being, so involved even as a backdrop for the story. And then Traveler is out in left field, completely different, but lots of fun as well. A lot of snark, but also some kind of frightening moments in there, and some interesting things where I really do kind of pull in real things, real history, real people, without being real specific about who those people are. But there's a lot in that book. I love taking real people from history and giving them voice and letting them be alive again in the books, as opposed to just kind of a blurb on a textbook, a history book page.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and close out here. And I'd like to thank Nola for reading for us and discussing her book and
Thank you
giving
for
us
having me.
all the teases about the books to come.
I know, exciting.